Imagine facing off against a creature that hasn't walked the earth in 10,000 years, only for the living animal to roll over in its enclosure and want a scratch behind the ears from a total stranger in a fenced yard. The de-extinction project just hit a massive, furry roadblock that no scientist, no biotech founder, and no seasoned journalist covering the field saw coming. And it changes everything we thought we knew about bringing lost species back into the modern world. Today, we are uncovering the shocking reason why the so-called dire wolves being born inside a Texas biotech lab are actively choosing domestication over destruction of the wild kind that once dominated North America during the final ice age. The animals in question have been named Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, and their calm, surprisingly social behavior has already upset every prediction the original scientific team had quietly built into the project plan 2 years earlier in the lab's first proposal documents. Founder Ben Lamb and his team at Colossal Biosciences officially unveiled the pups in April 2025, and the global reaction tilted quickly from marvel at the achievement to genuine scientific anxiety almost overnight, as the first behavioral data trickled out through the press. These are the 5 forces that turned a celebrated de-extinction milestone into an open scientific and ethical question about whether what just left the lab is even a dire wolf by any real biological standard at all. The first chapter is the rebirth itself, the public debut of predators that look, at a glance, like ghosts from the closing chapter of the last ice age. Canis durus, the dire wolf of the famous La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, was one of the most successful large predators in the Americas during the late Pleistocene epoch, existing from roughly 250,000 years ago until about 9,500 to 10,000 years ago at sites ranging from Florida down into South America. Over 4,000 individual dire wolf specimens have been recovered from the La Brea site alone, according to the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County's published records, a number that vastly exceeds every other large carnivore found there, and strongly suggests these animals were highly social pack hunters, drawn back to the same prey-trapping locations repeatedly over centuries. They were, on average, about 25 to 30% heavier than modern gray wolves, with adult body weights regularly estimated between 130 and 175 pounds, and some larger individuals reportedly reaching toward 200 pounds at full skeletal maturity in their natural habitat. Their skulls were broader and far more powerful than any modern wolf, featuring heavy jaw musculature and bone-crushing carnassial teeth more similar in geometry to a modern spotted hyena's dentition than to a living gray wolf's dental profile, suggesting a real scavenging component or specialized carcass processing role in their daily feeding ecology across their range. A landmark 2021 study published in the journal Nature, led by paleogenomicist Angela Perry of Durham University alongside a large international collaborator group, successfully sequenced ancient DNA from 5 dire wolf specimens and revealed that dire wolves were not close relatives of modern gray wolves in any meaningful genetic sense. The Perry-led study showed the 2 canid lineages had been separated for roughly 5.7 million years of independent evolution, a genetic distance so vast that interbreeding appears to have been biologically impossible despite 10,000 years of geographic overlap on the same North American continent. In practical terms, a true dire wolf was about as genetically distant from a living gray wolf as a lion is from a domestic house cat, even though the two looked superficially similar to untrained eyes in photographs and museum reconstructions everywhere from high school textbooks to mainstream nature documentaries across decades of broadcasting. The second chapter is the epigenetic domesticity glitch, and this is where the entire emotional narrative of the project flipped upside down very quickly on the team. Because the editing process used the modern gray wolf genome as its foundational template, the resulting pups carry not only the targeted genetic modifications intended to approximate dire wolf traits, but the entire behavioral genetic architecture of Canis lupus underneath that, including thousands of variants that shape social bonding, stress reactivity, and aggression thresholds in all living canids. The domestic dog descended from gray wolves through a process spanning at least 15,000 years of coevolution with human populations, and along that path, the oxytocin system itself was progressively rewired, producing animals whose bonding behavior with humans exceeds what is observed between living wild wolves even today at sanctuaries. The oxytocin receptor gene, sometimes shortened by researchers to Oxter, has been central to this body of dog domestication research over the last 20 years. Because artificial selection in dogs enriched for specific genetic variants that produce the famously affiliative, trust-heavy dog-human bond we see in every household pet on the planet today. If the gray wolf template used in the de-extinction project carries any incipient version of those domestication-friendly oxytocin variants, and the published genetic data suggests it almost certainly does given its evolutionary proximity to the dog lineage, then the resulting animals would plausibly show amplified social bonding, compared with what a true Ice Age dire wolf could ever have expressed in any natural context 12,000 years ago. Epigenetics adds another thick layer of biological complexity directly on top of that underlying genetic fact. Because heritable changes in gene expression driven by developmental environment, maternal experience, nutritional status, and early life conditioning can partially or substantially override even strong underlying genetic predispositions toward wild-type behavior across mammalian species. The colossal pups were raised from the very first day of life in controlled nursery conditions with consistent adult human presence, exactly the early environment that maximizes early imprinting on human social cues and minimizes the development of stable fear responses toward adult humans at any future point in the animal's life. That kind of early life experiential programming is essentially identical in effect to what domestic dog breeders have been doing for tens of thousands of generations of deliberate selective breeding, which means the pups quietly inherited a behavioral package no Pleistocene dire wolf ever carried into adulthood in the wild landscape of their own deep evolutionary past. The third chapter is the science of the synthetic pack, and the day-to-day behavior of the three animals has been far more dog-like than any experienced wild canid handler expected to see in a lifetime of work with wolves and wolf-dog hybrids in field settings. The behavioral profile reported by Colossal's animal care team and covered across multiple respected science journalism outlets described the three animals as displaying strong, stable social bonds with each other inside their shared enclosure. Active approach behavior toward familiar human handlers during routine visits throughout the day. Distinctly low startle reactivity to environmental stimuli like sudden loud noises and unfamiliar moving objects, and a notable absence of the hypervigilance that characterizes truly wild wolves, even when those wild wolves are hand-reared intensively from the first day of life in zoo nurseries. This behavioral result is not wholly unprecedented in the canid captive-rearing research literature at established conservation zoos, because standard wolf pups hand-raised intensively from birth can become significantly more tolerant of human presence than typical adult captive wolves in standard zoo programs. The sheer degree of relaxed, calm behavior reported in the colossal animals, however, exceeded what is typical even in hand-raised gray wolf pups in published studies across multiple peer-reviewed datasets at major universities. The science behind this striking behavioral pattern is partly about predatory sequence expression, the linked chain of orient, stalk, chase, bite, kill, and then consume behaviors that makes up the full predatory program in large terrestrial carnivores like wolves and bears. Animals raised from birth in environments where chasing live prey, capturing it, and processing it for food is never behaviorally reinforced, and where all of their daily food arrives predictably through a steel bowl without the need for any predatory behavior at all, show measurable reductions in how often they actually run that full predatory sequence in adulthood across years of life inside captivity. The underlying predatory neural circuitry stays fully intact in the animal's brain architecture. It simply has no real-world context in which to express itself, because no live prey animal has ever been encountered in any meaningful way since the pup's eyes first opened for the very first time inside the laboratory's controlled nursery space. The animal's day-to-day social behavior, including the routine initiation of play bouts with familiar handlers, the regular display of submission postures during routine physical handling of the animals, and the active seeking of close human interaction during quiet afternoon downtime moments, reflects the natural expression of deep-seated canid bonding capacities now applied to familiar humans as substitute pack members in a safe and predictable setting. The absolutely critical point, and the one most often missed in the viral public video coverage that spread across social media platforms, is that this comfort is not the same thing at all as the predictable long-term safety of an ordinary domestic dog. The reason is plain biology. These animals still measure well over 100 pounds in body weight and carry the bone-crushing dentition designed by deep evolution for processing the massive megafauna carcasses that once filled their Pleistocene landscape. The fourth chapter is the dangerously familiar shadow, and this is where genuine expert concern escalates sharply from purely academic discussion into urgent operational reality inside any facility that holds large carnivores for any length of time. Large canids undergo significant and well-documented behavioral transformation at the moment of sexual maturity, typically between 18 months and 3 full years of age, with the sudden emergence of territorial behavior, status-testing aggression toward familiar family members, and more assertive responses to perceived challenges from unfamiliar human strangers in equal measure. Even fully socialized, intensively human-raised wolves can become significantly more dangerous at exactly this critical life stage. A behavioral transition that has produced serious injuries to experienced handlers in documented captive wolf facilities and conservation centers over many decades of published working practice around the world across multiple continents. The communication patterns reported for these de-extinct animals differed from standard gray wolf behavioral profiles in subtle, but genuinely important ways that add practical uncertainty to any future safety prediction. Specifically, the pups displayed what their handlers described as fewer overall vocalizations and distinctly less distance-increasing body language than expected from any published reference population of Canis lupus across many field studies. In wild wolf populations studied across decades of careful fieldwork in Yellowstone and other major research sites, those standard vocalizations and body language signals serve the essential function of maintaining safe spacing between pack members and clearly communicating discomfort to other animals before any actual physical conflict breaks out in the group. So their complete absence here is, counterintuitively, a real safety risk rather than any kind of reassurance to anyone working around the animals daily for years on end. If the animal eventually reaches a critical threshold that triggers defensive aggression or territorial behavior at full maturity, the approach to that behavioral threshold may be functionally invisible to human observers until the animal is already physically committed to an aggressive response at its full body weight and bite force in close quarters. Dormant predatory instincts remain a serious ongoing concern for conservation experts regardless of how genuinely calm the current behavior truly is in the public videos circulating online across social platforms. The neural architecture for full apex predator behavior never disappears just because it is not currently being expressed in any visible or measurable form in the moment of the recorded footage. It requires the right combination of environmental triggers, including high arousal social situations, the sudden appearance of fast-moving prey-like objects in open space, direct food competition between closely bonded pack members, or any perceived threat against a closely bonded individual in the social group, to fully activate after months or even years of apparent dormancy inside the controlled environment of the laboratory enclosure walls. That delayed activation pattern is one of the most operationally dangerous features of any large captive carnivore, and it is precisely why experienced facility staff document every unusual environmental cue in these animals from day one. The recorded history of captive large predator incidents across tigers, brown bears, and large canids globally is largely a history of animals whose behavioral profiles were described as calm, friendly, or even domesticated right up until the single moment they were not. The practical severity of every such outcome is then magnified enormously by the raw body size and bite force of the specific animal, involved in each serious incident over many decades of careful documentation in zoo and sanctuary records. The fifth chapter is the future of our ancient companions, and right now the entire situation sits squarely inside a legal and ethical no man's land, with no real precedent anywhere on the planet to guide anyone forward into the genuinely unknown territory ahead. The regulatory landscape for these de-extinct species is essentially non-existent in most of the world's major jurisdictions at the time of writing the documentary record on the topic, because the specific animals produced by this project are not members of any extant species listed under existing wildlife protection frameworks anywhere in the developed world to date. In the United States alone, multiple federal regulatory agencies, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the United States Department of Agriculture, and the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates genetically modified animals under its broad statutory authority. All have overlapping and potentially conflicting jurisdictional claims over engineered animals of this specific type, in the absence of any unified, comprehensive federal framework. On top of that, no comprehensive legal framework for de-extinct species has been established in any single country yet. So the exact legal status of these particular animals depends entirely on which agency first decides to claim active jurisdiction over a specific case, and how broadly they interpret their own existing statutory language in this newly emerging scientific context. The deeper philosophical debate over what de-extinction actually produces in biological terms may matter far more than any narrow regulatory question in the very long run of the biotech field. If a true dire wolf is defined as a member of the species Canis durus with its specific evolutionary lineage and its distinctive identifiable genetic heritage, then what Colossal has produced is, by any rigorous consensus biological standard, not actually a true dire wolf at all. It is instead a novel genetically modified organism with some carefully engineered dire-wall genetic background of recent origin. How we choose to describe that complex scientific artifact has real implications for conservation prioritization around the world, and for public perception of extinction itself as a fully reversible biological process for future ecosystem funding decisions everywhere. The deepest ethical question touches on something philosophers of biology have debated seriously for decades in the published academic literature. Does an animal have an essential identity that extends meaningfully beyond what its outward physical appearance shows to any casual viewer simply looking at a viral photograph online today? Does a real dire wolf's identity truly include its entire unbroken evolutionary history, its ancient ecological relationships with now-vanished prey species, its complete behavioral repertoire, and its deep genetic lineage stretching back hundreds of thousands of years? If the answer is yes, can any of those essential features be honestly recreated once the unbroken evolutionary thread itself has been cut forever by complete wild extinction in every living habitat? Most working conservation biologists would argue that what has actually been produced here is something genuinely new under the modern sun, a human-designed organism that never existed before in this specific engineered form. It is inspired by, but fundamentally not biologically equivalent to, the Ice Age predator, whose evocative name now carries around it the most consequential scientific, legal, and ethical cargo that the entire biotechnology industry has yet generated in its short history. If this fundamental question of what actually counts as a real dire wolf is keeping you up at night right now, then the next video will go much deeper into the single ancient genetic finding that made the entire Colossal project scientifically possible in the first place, and the heavy hidden cost of that single, irreversible scientific decision. That follow-up video will carefully reveal the one specific ancient DNA sample that should honestly have stopped the entire project before it ever began in any real working laboratory, and exactly why no one on the broader scientific team was willing to talk about that uncomfortable sample openly on the public record in front of any camera. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell right now so you absolutely do not miss the genetic bombshell that quietly rewrites what de-extinction is actually capable of delivering for any lost species we all still deeply mourn across the natural world today.